who held them in his hand. I put my face up next to them so they would think of me as a warm, friendly God. And I sang to them, I sang, abide with me, fast falls the eventide, the darkness deep. And she said, what are you doing? She said, turned, and she heard me singing. What are you doing? I said, I'm just looking at this tomato. Put that down, she said. It's rotten. No, it's not rotten. It's full of life. It's beautiful. My sister was very disapproving of me. She was always eager to point out my mistakes. She was practicing to be somebody's mother. I studied the tomato, and then I held it up in the air, and I said, thou who didst give life to this tomato, I beseech thee, bless these thy creatures as they return to the soil from whence they have sprung. She turned in disgust. And something outside myself, a force outside myself, brought my arm back. Better they should die in a big splash than just weaken in the cold. I delivered this tomato planet into the air, and it turned slowly in the air like a planet rotating. I was already running towards the house. I could hear the splat, and I could hear, hey, she cried. And then she was running after me. I ran as fast as I could. I ducked under the clotheslines, and I tore around the house and down to Green Street, and I hung a left, and I went down to McKinley and took a left down by the Chatterbox Cafe. She was running after me, yelling things that a Christian child would not yell, about violence, about fratricide. I took a turn up Main Street, and I was heading for safety sanctuary somewhere, and then I saw my Uncle Jack Peterson get out of his pickup truck, and he was just opening the front door of the sidetrack tap. I had never been in there before in my life. I made it just in time. Talk about divine intervention. I just leaped in alongside him through the door into this swamp of manhood, this smoky place that smelled of beer and whiskey and vomit. I ran past the jukebox. Nobody saw me. They were in no condition to observe things at all. They were within themselves. I ran past the jukebox down to a dark corner by the hall that went down to the men's toilet, which is just unspeakable, the smell of it. I knew that if she came in through the door, that's where I'd have to hide. Well, she didn't come through the door. I sat there for almost an hour, and I couldn't believe the things that I heard in there when they didn't know a child was around. These were men I'd seen in town. These were farmers. There was a couple of mechanics in there from Bunsen Motors. Carl Krupsbach was in there. They were telling dirty jokes like I couldn't believe. The joke about the young man from Antietam who loved horse turds so well he could eat them. They did that. They sang that. There was a young girl in Madras who had a remarkable ass. Not soft, round, and pink, as you probably think, but the kind with long ears that eats grass. There was an old man at Khartoum who kept a young sheep in his room. It reminds me, he said, of a loved one long dead, and I never can quite recall whom. And then my Uncle Jack, the only one in our family to drink so hard, had a couple of beers and a couple of bunks, and he leaned back on his stool and he started to sing a song I had never, ever heard him sing before. Oh, the farmer had a champion bull, bred 200 times a year. The farmer's wife said 200 times, why, that's remarkable, dear. Maybe you ought to watch him, maybe he'd show you how. The farmer said, he's a champion bull, but it wasn't just with one cow. Oh, the devil came to church one day in a burst of smoke and flame. He ran up and down the aisles. He said, Beelzebub is my name. I am evil incarnate, the object of all your fears. The old man said, you don't scare me at all. Been married to your sister for 38 years. When God created woman, he gave her not 2 breasts, but 3. But the middle one got in the way, so God performed surgery. Woman came before God with the middle breast in her hand. She said, what shall we do with the useless boob? And God created man. There was more. He went on and on. It was just much too raw for me. I slipped out the back door, looked both ways up the alley, and I headed for home. I headed up Green Street and then down the alley and come in by the backyard. The sun had gone down. I could see the lights on in my house. I stepped into the backyard, and there was my family sitting around the dining room table, eating meatloaf and green beans and scalloped potatoes and green jello with sliced bananas and Miracle Whip on it. I stood there in the backyard and I watched them. It was interesting to stand outside your family and see that chair, my chair, vacant, like in the old song, we shall meet, but we shall miss him. There will be one vacant chair. We shall linger to caress him as we breathe our evening prayer. And I could imagine that I had died and they were gathered for supper. And they seemed to be getting along perfectly well without me. I could now imagine what was unimaginable, which is a world without me in it. And it wouldn't matter that much. It was a terrifying thought. I came in through the kitchen and I came into the dining room. And when I sat down in the chair, my mother looked up in surprise. And I could see by the look on her face that she hadn't missed me until I walked in. She said, you smell of smoke and beer. Where have you been? Well, it was a good time to bow my head and say a silent prayer and thank the Lord for all of his gifts while I could think of something. So I did, and I took my time. And then I raised my head and I said, I went into the sidetrack tap to witness to Uncle Jack. My sister formed the word liar. I said, you smell of tomato. Where have you been? She picked up a pitcher of ice water and she came around to pour it into our glasses. And I clutched my shirt and I held my collar very, very tight so that she could not do that which she would do. And she just leaned down next to my left ear and she said, you are going to be sorry someday. You are going to be so sorry. Well, you know, I haven't been. I haven't been. It was an awakening for me. You need to make mistakes. You need to fly outside the line. You need to offend before you can really find out who you are. I'm not sure this is a message that we're giving our young people as clearly as we should. I meet young people and they're so well behaved and so well spoken and so thoughtful and respectful that I just wonder what happened to that good old American tradition of pissing on people. What happened to meanness and cruelty? I grew up, you see, at a time when they didn't have the word parenting. There wasn't a verb back then. You had parents, 2 of them, and they lived their own lives. They had their own lives, and they were old and slow and boring, and you stayed away from them. Your parents did not arrange your social life for you. And life was harsh, and you learned that when you were a kid, because you were pushed out. You were pushed outside. Boys were, especially. Boys were pushed out as soon as you're old enough to tie your own shoe and ask somebody where the toilet was. You were pushed out the door, and you were raised by other children. And you learned to stay out of earshot and just to avoid grown-ups as much as possible and to invent your own games, which were violent and bloody and maudlin, laced with cruelty. We did all of that when we were children. Girls got to stay indoors and play with dolls and create extended family groups and work out problems through role-playing and negotiation. And boys ran around with sticks, shooting each other and arguing about who was dead. Who was better qualified to manage things? I ask you. I don't know.